My name is Beverly, and I'm 54 years old. When my husband Richard died and left me nothing but a crumbling house in Montana, I thought it was his final act of revenge. Standing here in front of this broken down cabin, surrounded by wilderness and regret, I had no idea that opening that door would reveal the most shocking truth about our 30-year marriage. What I discovered inside didn't just change everything I thought I knew about Richard, it completely transformed the story of my entire life. Before we dive into this journey, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories like this one. This tale spans 3 decades of heartbreak and betrayal, leading to the most unexpected discovery that turned my greatest disappointment into my most precious gift. Let me take you back to Denver in 1974, where it all began. I first laid eyes on Richard Henderson on a cold February morning at Denver General Hospital. I was 24 years old, working as a registered nurse in the cardiac unit when he walked into room 212 to visit his father, who'd suffered a massive heart attack the night before. Richard was 28, then standing 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair that caught the morning light streaming through the hospital windows. He wore a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, and when he shook my hand, his grip was firm and confident. Everything about him radiated success and stability. He worked as a civil engineer for Morrison Construction, one of the biggest firms in Colorado. During those long visits with his father, Richard would tell me about the bridges he designed, the highways he planned, the satisfaction of creating something permanent and important that would serve people for generations. When he asked me to dinner after his father recovered, I felt like the luckiest woman in Denver. Richard took me to The Broker, an elegant steakhouse downtown that I'd only dreamed of entering. He ordered wine, like someone who understood such things, spoke about his work with passion, and listened to my stories about nursing school like they were the most fascinating tales he'd ever heard. Our courtship unfolded like a perfect romance novel. Every Friday, Richard brought me yellow roses because he said they matched my blonde hair and sunny disposition. We'd spend weekends hiking in the Rocky Mountains, where he'd point out geological formations and explain how engineers worked with nature instead of against it. Richard had plans for everything, including us. He wanted to buy a house in Cherry Creek, start a family, maybe open his own engineering firm someday. When he talked about our future, his eyes lit up with a certainty that made me feel safe and cherished. We married on June 26, 1976, at Riverside Methodist Church, where I'd attended Sunday school as a child. I wore my grandmother's ivory silk dress, and Richard looked so handsome in his charcoal gray tuxedo that I actually gasped when I saw him waiting at the altar. During our vows, when Richard promised to love me, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, his voice cracked with emotion. I believed every single word, believed we were building something that would last forever. The first years of our marriage felt magical. Richard's career flourished, bringing in more money than I'd ever imagined possible. He purchased a beautiful 2-story colonial house on Elm Street with a wraparound porch and a garden where I could grow tomatoes and sunflowers. It was Richard who suggested I leave my job at the hospital. "Why should my beautiful wife work when I can provide for both of us?" he'd say, wrapping his arms around my waist in our sunny yellow kitchen. "I want you to be happy to pursue your interests, to get ready for the babies we'll have." The word babies made my heart flutter every time he mentioned it. We spent countless evenings planning our future children's lives. Richard dreamed of teaching a son to play baseball and take camping trips. I imagined reading bedtime stories to a little girl, with Richard's intelligent eyes and my stubborn streak. We even selected names during those blissful early years. Michael for a boy, Sarah for a girl. Richard would sometimes place his hand on my still flat stomach and whisper, "When little Michael gets here, I'll teach him to build things with his hands, just like his old man." Those golden years felt like living inside a greeting card. I kept our house immaculate, cooked elaborate meals, using recipes from my mother's collection, and waited eagerly each evening for Richard's car to pull into our driveway. He'd walk through the front door with stories about foundation problems solved and construction deadlines met his face, animated with professional satisfaction. But sometime during our 4th year together, subtle changes began appearing like hairline cracks in a perfect foundation. Richard started working longer hours, staying at the office until 8 or 9 at night. When I'd ask about his day, his responses grew shorter and more distant. "How was the Morrison project today?" I'd inquire over dinner. "Fine." He'd answer, then retreat to his home office with blueprints and engineering manuals. I convinced myself this distance was temporary, just the natural pressure of a successful career demanding more attention. Surely, once we started having children, Richard's focus would return to our family where it belonged. How foolish I was to think love alone could overcome what was coming next. By 1982, we'd been trying to conceive for 6 long years. Initially, we weren't concerned. We were young and healthy, and everyone assured us these things took time. But as month after month passed without pregnancy, a cold dread began settling deep in my bones. Dr. Patricia Williams delivered the devastating news in her sterile office on a gray February afternoon after months of invasive tests and procedures. She explained that severe scarring from an untreated infection in my early 20s had completely blocked both fallopian tubes. Natural conception would be impossible. The silence following her words felt suffocating. Richard sat motionless beside me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at the medical diplomas hanging on the wall behind Dr. Williams's desk. I kept waiting for him to reach over and squeeze my hand to tell me everything would work out somehow. But he never moved, never spoke, never looked at me. The drive home stretched endlessly. I cried quietly in the passenger seat while Richard gripped the steering wheel and kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When we reached our house, he walked straight to his office and shut the door without saying a word. I sat alone in our cheerful kitchen, surrounded by the sunny yellow walls I'd painted with such hope during our newlywed days, feeling like my entire world had just crumbled to dust. That evening at dinner, I finally gathered courage to mention adoption. "There are so many children who need loving homes," I whispered, barely able to force the words past the lump in my throat. "We could still be parents, Richard. We could still have the family we've dreamed about." Richard set down his fork and fixed me with a stare I'd never seen before. His brown eyes had turned cold, almost hostile. "I don't want someone else's child," he said flatly. "I want my own son carrying my own blood and my own name." The words struck me like physical blows. "But Richard, think about all the love we have to offer. Does it really matter whether the child shares our DNA?" His expression hardened even further. "It matters to me, Beverly. Some disappointments can't be fixed or worked around. Some dreams just die." From that terrible night forward, our marriage became a graveyard of unspoken resentments and abandoned hopes. Richard buried himself even deeper in his work, often staying at the office until midnight. When he was home, he spoke to me in clipped, polite sentences, like I was a housekeeper he barely tolerated. His mother, Margaret, made the situation infinitely worse with her constant questions and barely concealed accusations. Still no good news to share. She'd ask every Sunday after church, her sharp eyes scanning my flat stomach with obvious disappointment. Richard was such a beautiful baby. He deserves to pass on the Henderson family name. The isolation during those years felt crushing. I'd wake up each morning in our beautiful empty house and feel like I was drowning in silence. Richard would leave for work before sunrise, and I'd spend endless hours wandering from room to room, dusting furniture that didn't need cleaning, organizing closets that were already perfectly arranged. I threw myself into volunteer work at the Denver Animal Shelter, but even the unconditional affection of abandoned cats and dogs couldn't fill the expanding void in my heart. At night, I'd lie in bed next to Richard's rigid back, listening to him breathe, wondering how 2 people could share a home, yet feel like complete strangers. It was during the spring of 1985 that I began noticing more significant changes in Richard's behavior. He started taking frequent business trips that seemed to occur every other weekend. He'd pack his expensive leather suitcase with unusual care, humming quietly while he folded his best dress shirts. Where did you say this conference was located? I asked one Friday evening as he prepared to leave. Colorado Springs, he answered without making eye contact. Important engineering symposium, critical for networking and professional development. But when I called the hotel that Saturday night just to wish him good night, the desk clerk informed me that no engineering conference was scheduled that weekend. Furthermore, they had no reservation under the name Richard Henderson at all. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that my husband was lying to me about his whereabouts. And if he was deceiving me about his business trips, I could only imagine what other lies might be lurking beneath the surface of our crumbling marriage. The complete truth, when I finally discovered it, proved far worse than anything my frightened imagination had conjured. The evidence that shattered my world forever was hidden in Richard's desk drawer tucked behind a stack of old construction blueprints. I found it on a sweltering August afternoon in 1985 while searching for our insurance documents after a minor car accident. Inside a manila envelope were photographs that made my knees buckle. Richard, with a young woman I'd never seen before, her sleek dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her smile radiant and carefree. They sat together at an intimate restaurant table, fingers intertwined, gazing at each other with unmistakable love. Another photo showed them standing on what appeared to be a mountain overlook. His arms wrapped protectively around her waist, both laughing at something beyond the camera's reach. But it was the letters that truly destroyed me. Page after page written in Richard's familiar handwriting, all addressed to my beloved Sarah. He described how she made him feel alive again after years of feeling dead inside. He wrote about her infectious laughter, her brilliant mind, her ability to understand his dreams and ambitions. "You've given me hope for a real future," one letter declared. "With you, I can finally imagine having the family I've always wanted. Children who will carry forward my legacy and my name. You've reminded me who I used to be before everything became so complicated and disappointing." I sat on the floor of his office for what felt like hours, reading letter after letter, each one a dagger thrust deeper into my chest. Richard wrote about places he'd taken Sarah that we'd never visited together, about dreams and plans that completely excluded me. Most devastating of all, he described feeling imprisoned in his marriage to a defective woman who can't provide what I need most. When Richard arrived home that evening, I was waiting in our living room with the letters spread across the coffee table like evidence in a murder trial. His face drained of all color when he saw them, but he didn't attempt to deny anything. Instead, he sat down across from me with a calmness that felt more terrifying than rage would have been. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite my trembling hands. 2 years, he replied simply. "I met her at a professional conference in Denver. She works as a project coordinator for the Colorado Department of Transportation." "Sarah," I said, remembering her name from his passionate letters. He nodded once. "Sarah Mitchell. She's 25 years old." 25. The exact same age I'd been when Richard and I first met at the hospital. But unlike me, Sarah possessed the one thing I could never give him. "Are you in love with her?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. Richard remained silent for a long moment, studying his hands folded in his lap. When he finally looked up, his eyes contained something I hadn't seen in years: genuine emotion. Life, hope, joy. "Yes," he said quietly. "I love her more than I've ever loved anything." That single word hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, but I forced myself to keep breathing. What happens now? I want a divorce, Beverly. I want to marry Sarah and start the family I've always dreamed of having. She's already pregnant with my child. Pregnant. The word echoed in my skull like a gunshot. Sarah was carrying Richard's baby, the child I could never give him, the future I could never provide. But even through all the agony and betrayal, even knowing he'd been living a double life for 2 years, while I believed our marriage was simply going through a difficult phase, I couldn't let go. "Richard, please," I begged. We can work through this together. We can try counseling. I love you. I've always loved you with my whole heart. His expression hardened into something resembling pity mixed with contempt. Love isn't enough anymore, Beverly. It never was enough. I need more than what you can possibly give me. What about our 11 years together? What about the vows we made, the promises we swore to keep? I tried, he said, rising and walking toward the window. God knows I tried to make myself satisfied with what we had. But I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Sarah offers me a real future with real children. And I don't offer you anything real. He turned back to face me, and the pity in his eyes felt worse than hatred. You can't give me sons to carry on my name, Beverly. Without that possibility, what's the point of any of this? That night, Richard packed 2 suitcases and left to move in with Sarah permanently. He said he'd return for his remaining belongings and to work out the practical details of our divorce proceedings. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the cruelty of his words, I still believed the man I'd fallen in love with existed somewhere inside this stranger. I told him I needed time to process everything, that I wouldn't sign any divorce papers until we'd made a genuine attempt to save our marriage. Richard's response was swift and calculated. He cut off my access to our joint checking and savings accounts, canceled the credit cards, and had the utilities switched to his name only. You'll eventually agree to the divorce, he said during one of his cold telephone calls. I'm just helping you understand how much simpler this will be if you cooperate willingly. But I refused to cooperate. Even as my comfortable world collapsed around me, even as friends began avoiding me because of the messy drama surrounding our separation, I clung to the foolish hope that Richard would eventually come to his senses and remember what we'd once meant to each other. I had no idea that my stubborn refusal to let him go would define the next 30 years of my life. The 3 decades that followed Richard's departure were a masterclass in emotional endurance and psychological warfare. He moved to Montana with Sarah in late 1985 after accepting a position as senior engineer for a major interstate highway project. Sarah delivered their first child, a son named Michael, in March of 1986. The cruel irony of that name wasn't lost on me. Every single year, like clockwork, I received official legal documents requesting my consent to an uncontested divorce. Every single year, I returned them unsigned with a brief note, I honor the vows I made before God and witnesses. It wasn't that I believed Richard would return to me. By the 5th or 6th year, even I wasn't that delusional. It was something deeper and more stubborn than hope. It was principle. Richard had sworn before God to love me till death do us part. If he wanted to break those sacred vows, he could pursue a contested divorce through the courts, prove abandonment or irreconcilable differences, and pay the substantial legal fees. But I refused to make his betrayal convenient or inexpensive. Meanwhile, I had to figure out how to survive financially and emotionally. With no access to our joint savings and no recent work experience, I was forced to move out of our beautiful Cherry Creek house and into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a questionable neighborhood. I returned to nursing, taking night shifts at Denver General because they paid slightly more and because working in darkness seemed appropriate for how I felt inside. Richard's new life flourished while mine withered. Through mutual acquaintances and occasional overheard conversations, I learned that Sarah had given birth to 2 additional children, a daughter named Emma in 1988 and another son called David in 1991. Richard finally had his perfect family, his biological legacy, his dream of sons to carry forward the Henderson name. His engineering firm, Henderson Construction Solutions, became one of Montana's most successful companies. I saw a magazine article about him once standing proudly beside a bridge he designed, his 3 beautiful children clustered around him like models in a catalog advertisement. The loneliness during those years was suffocating, but the judgment from others was equally difficult to bear. Why won't you just let him go? My sister Linda would ask during her increasingly infrequent phone calls. This isn't healthy, Beverly. You're wasting your entire life. But I couldn't explain to anyone, not even myself, why I held so fiercely to a marriage that existed only on paper. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the last remnant of a love that had once felt powerful enough to move mountains. Or perhaps it was simply that admitting defeat felt like erasing the only thing that had ever made me feel truly valuable as a human being. Richard would visit Denver occasionally for business meetings, and sometimes he'd appear at my apartment unannounced. These encounters were pure torture. He'd stand in my tiny living room, wearing expensive tailored suits, surveying my secondhand furniture and discount store decorations with obvious disgust. "This is absolutely ridiculous, Beverly," he'd say. "Look at how you're living. You could have received a reasonable settlement years ago. You could have moved forward with your life instead of wallowing in this pathetic existence." "This is my life," I'd respond quietly. "I'm still your wife." "You're my legal wife," he'd correct me sharply. "Nothing more than that. Sarah is my real wife. She's the mother of my children. You're just a stubborn piece of paper I can't get rid of." His words were carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, and they succeeded every time. But I'd learned to maintain a blank expression during these confrontations, refusing to give him the satisfaction of witnessing how deeply his cruelty cut. The final time I saw Richard was in October of 2014. He looked older than his 58 years, his hair mostly gray, deep lines etched around his eyes from stress and illness. He'd come to deliver devastating news. He'd been diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer and had perhaps 6 months left to live. "I want to die as Sarah's husband," he said, sitting stiffly on my worn secondhand couch. "Not yours. Please, Beverly. After all these wasted years, can't you find it somewhere in your heart to let me go peacefully?" For a moment, looking at this man who had once been the great love of my life, now reduced by disease and time to someone I barely recognized, I almost said yes, almost ended the long, bitter standoff that had consumed both our lives for 3 decades. Instead, I heard myself saying, "You made a sacred promise to me, Richard. If you want to break that promise, you'll have to do it without my cooperation or assistance." He died 7 months later, in May of 2015, still legally married to me despite 30 years of separation. The funeral service was held in Billings, Montana. I wasn't invited, but I drove up anyway and stood at the back of the cemetery during the burial ceremony. Sarah, now 50 years old, stood at the graveside surrounded by their 3 grown children and what appeared to be dozens of friends and colleagues. She wore an elegant black dress that probably cost more than I earned in 3 months, and her grief seemed deep and genuine. I watched from a distance as they lowered Richard's casket into the Montana earth, and I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no relief, no sense of closure. Just a vast emptiness where my anger and stubbornness had lived for so many years. It was 2 weeks later when the attorney called about Richard's final will and testament. The reading of Richard's will took place in a sterile conference room at Walsh Patterson and Associates law firm in downtown Billings. I sat alone on one side of the polished mahogany table while Sarah and her 3 children occupied the opposite side, their faces displaying emotions ranging from confusion to open hostility toward my unexpected presence. Richard's attorney, a thin man named Gregory Walsh, cleared his throat and began reading from the legal document that would distribute my late husband's considerable wealth among his survivors. As expected, Sarah inherited the family home, the successful engineering business, all investment accounts, and the substantial life insurance policy. Each of the children received generous trust funds that would ensure their financial security for their entire lives. Then Mr. Walsh paused and looked directly at me across the table. "To my wife, Beverly Henderson," he read in his formal legal voice, "I leave the property located at 1427 Pine Ridge Road in Bear Creek, Montana, along with all structures and contents therein." Sarah's oldest son, Michael, now 29 years old, and clearly his father's heir apparent, spoke up immediately. "That old hunting cabin, Dad hasn't been to that run-down place in years. The roof leaks and the foundation is crumbling. Mr. Walsh consulted his notes briefly. There's also a personal message from Mrs. Henderson. He slid a sealed envelope across the polished table toward me. Mr. Henderson specifically requested this be delivered to you privately. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, acutely aware of 4 pairs of eyes watching my every movement with barely concealed curiosity and resentment. Inside was a single sheet of expensive letterhead paper covered with Richard's handwriting, shakier than I remembered, but still unmistakably his. Beverly, the letter read, this property is the only thing you deserve after 30 years of vindictive selfishness and emotional manipulation. The house is worthless just like our marriage turned out to be. Maybe now you'll finally understand the price of your stubborn refusal to let people move on with their lives. Don't expect anything more from me, even in death. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse, maintaining a neutral expression despite the fresh wave of pain his final words had inflicted. Sarah was studying my face intently, obviously curious about Richard's last message, but I had no intention of sharing his concluding cruelty with anyone present. The drive back to Denver passed in a haze of interstate highways and confused emotions. I had no idea what to do with a run-down cabin in rural Montana. My first instinct was to sell it immediately to convert Richard's last insult into whatever modest amount of money it might generate. But something stopped me from making that decision. Perhaps it was curiosity about this place that had been significant enough for Richard to mention in his will. Perhaps it was the same stubborn streak that had kept me married to him for 30 years. Or perhaps it was simply that I had nothing else to occupy my time and no one else's expectations to meet. 3 months later, I loaded my few possessions into my aging Honda Civic and drove north toward Montana to see this final gift from my deceased husband. I had no plan beyond examining the property myself, no expectations beyond confirming that it was as worthless as Richard had claimed it would be. The GPS navigation system led me through increasingly remote roads until I was driving on gravel paths that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Bear Creek turned out to be a tiny community of maybe 200 residents, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were immediately noticed and discussed. 1427 Pine Ridge Road sat at the end of a dead-end dirt track surrounded by towering evergreen trees and complete silence. The cabin itself appeared exactly as Michael had described, old-weathered and thoroughly abandoned. The roof sagged in several places, paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips, and multiple windows were either cracked or missing entirely. I remained in my car for a long time staring at this final testament to Richard's contempt for me, trying to understand what emotions he'd wanted me to experience when I saw it. Disappointment, despair, a final confirmation that I'd wasted my entire adult life loving someone who had never truly loved me in return. An elderly woman emerged from a smaller cabin, approximately a quarter-mile away, and walked slowly toward my parked car. She appeared to be about 80 years old, with silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun, and remarkably bright blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. "You must be Beverly," she said when I rolled down my window. "I'm Martha Crawford. I live over in that direction." She pointed toward her own neat little cabin. "Richard told me you might come by someday to see the place." "Richard talked about me?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. Martha's weathered face remained unreadable. "Oh, yes, dear. He talked about you quite frequently, especially during these last few years when his health was declining." She gestured toward the run-down cabin. "You planning to go inside and look around?" I studied the decrepit building again and shook my head slowly. "I don't think so. I just wanted to see what he left me. It's about what I expected it would be." Martha was quiet for a moment, studying my face with those sharp, intelligent blue eyes. "Honey," she said finally, "I think you might be genuinely surprised by what you discover in there. Richard spent considerable time fixing that place up over the years, much more time than he ever let anyone know about. Fixing it up, but it looks completely abandoned. That's just the exterior, dear. Richard was very particular about keeping the outside looking uninviting and neglected. He said he didn't want to attract any unwanted attention from curious neighbors or potential thieves. Martha smiled mysteriously, but the inside tells a completely different story. Something in her tone made me examine the cabin with fresh eyes and greater attention to detail. Now that I looked more carefully, I began noticing things I'd missed during my initial assessment. The foundation appeared solid and recently repaired with fresh concrete. The front steps, while painted to look weathered and old, were actually in perfect structural condition. Even the broken windows had been replaced with new glass that had been artificially aged and distressed to match the others. He deliberately wanted it to look run down, I asked. Richard said it was important that nobody realized how much this place actually meant to him, Martha explained patiently. He told me it was his sanctuary, his private retreat where he could just be himself without any pretenses or expectations. My heart was beating faster now, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. Martha, what did Richard actually do when he came here? The old woman looked toward the cabin thoughtfully, then back at me. I believe that's something you need to discover for yourself, dear. But I will say this much, whatever you think you know about that man, there's considerably more to the story than you realize. She began walking back toward her own cabin, then turned around one final time. The key is hidden under the third stone from the left at the bottom of the front steps, she called out. Richard specifically said to tell you that if you ever decided to come. I watched Martha disappear into her own home, my mind racing with questions and possibilities I didn't dare allow myself to name. Then I turned back to face the cabin that Richard had disguised as a ruin, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in my chest. My hands shook violently as I searched under the stones at the base of the front steps. The third stone from the left was larger than the others and shifted easily when I lifted it, revealing a brass key that appeared well maintained despite the cabin's deliberately neglected exterior appearance. The front door opened smoothly, without the creak or resistance I'd expected from a building that looked completely abandoned. And then I stepped across the threshold, and my entire understanding of the previous 30 years shifted dramatically on its foundation. The interior of the cabin was absolutely beautiful, not just clean and well-maintained, but lovingly restored and decorated with a level of care that literally took my breath away. Hardwood floors gleamed with recent polish and protective finish. The walls were painted a warm sage green that I recognized instantly as my favorite color, the exact same shade I'd chosen for our bedroom in Denver during those early happy years. But it was the furniture that made my knees go weak and forced me to grab the doorframe for support. Every single piece was something I remembered from our early marriage items that had mysteriously disappeared over the years, as Richard gradually redecorated our house to suit his changing preferences and Sarah's influence. The wooden rocking chair my grandmother had given us as a wedding present sat beside a beautifully restored stone fireplace. The dining table where we'd eaten our first Thanksgiving dinner, as newlyweds, occupied the center of the main room, polished to a warm shine and set with the china pattern I'd chosen for our wedding registry. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat our original wedding photograph, the one where I'm laughing at something Richard whispered in my ear just before the photographer captured the moment. Next to it was the ceramic vase I'd made in a pottery class during our second year of marriage, now filled with dried yellow roses that matched the fresh ones he'd brought me every Friday during our courtship. I walked through the cabin in a complete daze, discovering room after room filled with memories I thought were lost forever. In the bedroom was the handmade quilt I'd sewn during those early hopeful years when I'd imagined using it to keep our future children warm during cold Colorado nights. The walls were covered with framed photographs of us from our dating period and early marriage hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park, celebrating my nursing school graduation dancing together at our friends' weddings. But it was the small room at the back of the cabin that truly shattered my heart into a million pieces. It was arranged as a private study with custom-built bookshelves and a beautiful writing desk positioned near a window that overlooked the pine forest. The desk surface was covered with papers, and when I examined them more closely, I realized they were letters. Hundreds upon hundreds of letters, all addressed to me in Richard's familiar handwriting, none of them ever mailed or delivered. I picked up the first letter with trembling hands, noting it was dated June 20th, 1986, just a few months after Richard had moved to Montana with Sarah and started his new life. My dearest Beverly, it began. I know you must hate me completely, and you have every right to feel that way. What I did to you, to us, to the sacred promises we made together was absolutely unforgivable. I see that truth clearly now. I was so consumed with anger about the children we couldn't have that I blamed you for something that was never your fault to begin with. I was cruel and selfish and proud, and I destroyed the most precious thing in my life because I was too stubborn to admit that my love for you was infinitely more important than any dreams of biological children. I collapsed into the chair at the writing desk and continued reading through my tears. Sarah gave birth to the baby yesterday, a son exactly like I always claimed I wanted. But when the nurses placed him in my arms for the first time, all I could think about was how desperately I wanted to share this moment with you. How much I needed to see your face light up with joy the way it always did whenever you held other people's babies at church or family gatherings. I realized that having a child without you feels empty and meaningless, like I'm living someone else's life instead of my own. Letter after letter told the same heartbreaking story of regret and endless longing. Richard wrote about missing my laughter, missing our deep conversations about books and movies and dreams, missing the way I used to hum softly while I cooked dinner in our sunny kitchen. He described the guilt that consumed him every single day, the sleepless nights when he'd lie awake next to Sarah and wish desperately that he was holding me instead. I want to come back to you. Read a letter dated August 15th, 1991. I want to drive to Denver, get down on my knees in your apartment and beg for your forgiveness. But how can I possibly ask you to take me back when I have 3 children with another woman? How can I destroy Sarah's life and break up my children's family the same way I destroyed yours? I made this bed through my own selfishness and cowardice, and now I have to lie in it forever, even though every night I dream of lying in our bed beside you. The dates on the letters revealed that Richard had been writing to me consistently for nearly 20 years. Some were brief notes scribbled during lunch breaks at construction sites. Others were long, agonized confessions that continued for multiple pages. All of them painted a picture of a man tormented by regret and desperate love for a wife he'd thrown away in a moment of anger and foolish pride. A letter dated September 3rd, 2008 stopped me completely. Beverly, I drove by your apartment building today during a business trip to Denver. You were coming home from work at the hospital, and you looked so tired and fragile. You've gotten thinner over the years, and your beautiful blonde hair has turned silver, but you're still the most gorgeous woman I've ever seen in my life. I wanted to jump out of the car and run to you to tell you how sorry I am for everything, to ask if there's any possibility you could ever find it in your heart to forgive me. But what right do I have to disrupt the life you've built without me? Who am I to come back now and ask for another chance when I threw away the first one so carelessly? The most recent letters written during Richard's battle with cancer were almost impossible to read through my tears. The disease is progressing faster than the doctors predicted, he wrote in increasingly shaky handwriting. They're saying I have maybe 2 months left now. I keep thinking about all the wasted years, all the opportunities I didn't take to make things right between us. I finally understand why you refused to give me a divorce, Beverly. It wasn't about money or spite or revenge like I told myself for so many years. You were holding on to the sacred promise we made to each other, the vow to love each other until death separated us. You were the only one of us who remembered what true love actually means. In his final letter, dated just 10 days before his death, Richard had written, I'm leaving you the cabin in my will, along with a message that I know will sound cruel and hurtful. I'm sorry for that one last act of cowardice, but I need you to see this place to read these letters, to finally understand that every single day for 30 years, I have loved you and regretted losing you more than words can express. This cabin contains everything that ever mattered to me about our life together. I hope someday you'll be able to forgive me. I hope someday you'll realize that my greatest achievement wasn't my engineering firm or my bridges or even my children. It was those 5 precious years when I was worthy of being your husband. I remained in that chair until the sun disappeared behind the mountains, reading letter after letter, crying, until I thought my heart might actually stop beating. This man who I'd believed hated me, who I'd thought saw me as nothing but an obstacle to his happiness, had been carrying the same love and pain I'd carried all these years. When I finally found the strength to explore the basement, I discovered Richard's woodworking shop. He'd built every piece of furniture in the cabin himself, the bookshelves, the dining table, even the frame for the bed upstairs. On his workbench sat an unfinished wooden jewelry box with "For Beverly" carefully carved into the lid. Next to it was a note in his handwriting, "For our 50th wedding anniversary, if God gives me that long, and if you'll have me back." I spent that first night in the cabin lying in the bed Richard had built with his own hands, covered by the quilt I'd sewn with such hope in our early years, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything I'd discovered. The man I'd resented for 30 years had been loving me the entire time. The marriage I'd thought was dead had been alive in his heart, just as it had remained alive in mine despite everything. But as the days turned into weeks, and I began transforming the cabin into my permanent home, the anger gradually faded into something more complex and ultimately more healing. Richard had been trapped by his own pride and the irreversible consequences of his choices, just as I'd been imprisoned by my stubborn refusal to let go of the past. We'd spent 3 decades loving each other from opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm, both too wounded and too afraid to take the first step toward reconciliation. Martha Crawford became my emotional anchor during those early weeks of discovery and adjustment. She'd bring me homemade soup and fresh baked bread, and we'd sit together on the cabin's front porch during the long summer evenings talking about life and loss, and the strange ways love can persist even through seemingly impossible circumstances. It was Martha who shared the details of Richard's routine during his visits to the cabin over the years. He'd arrive every Friday evening, she told me, rocking gently in the chair Richard had built for her as a thank you gift for watching over his property. Always came alone, never brought any of his Montana family with him. He'd spend the entire weekend working on repairs, writing at that desk of his, sometimes just sitting by the fireplace looking at those photographs of you both. Did he seem happy when he was here? I asked. Martha considered the question carefully before answering. Happy isn't quite the right word, she finally said. Peaceful, maybe. Like this was the only place in the world where he could stop pretending and just be himself. He told me once that when he was here in this cabin, he could imagine that his life in Billings was the dream, and this was his real existence. Did he ever mention Sarah, his children? He loved those children deeply, Martha said with conviction. Never doubt that for a moment. But he confessed to me once that he felt like he was watching someone else's life through a window, like he was playing a role in a story that didn't quite fit who he really was inside. He said the only time he felt like his authentic self was when he was here surrounded by memories of you. As summer slowly transitioned into fall, I began venturing into the small town of Bear Creek more frequently. It was the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and news of Richard's mysterious widow living in his secret cabin spread through the population quickly. People were genuinely kind, but understandably curious, and I found myself sharing the story of our complicated marriage more often than I'd ever intended. It was at the tiny Bear Creek Public Library that I met Elena Vasquez, the head librarian, and the closest thing the town had to a social coordinator. Elena was approximately my age, with graying dark hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life lived with joy, despite inevitable hardships. When she learned about my nursing background, she practically begged me to volunteer at the town's monthly health clinic. "We have a retired doctor who drives up from Billings once a month," she explained eagerly, "but we desperately need someone with your professional experience to help with blood pressure screenings and basic health education for our elderly residents." Working at the monthly clinic gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. These were good, hard-working people farming families who often couldn't afford regular medical care in the bigger cities. I found myself looking forward to clinic days, to the profound satisfaction of feeling useful and genuinely needed by my community. Gradually, without any conscious plan or intention, I began building a completely new life in Bear Creek. I had the cabin properly winterized and purchased a reliable truck for navigating the mountain roads during snow season. Elena introduced me to the other women in town, and soon I was part of a book club that met monthly at the library to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary romance novels. It was Elena who first suggested I consider opening a small business in town. This community could really benefit from a place where people can get a decent cup of coffee and maybe a homemade meal, she said one afternoon as we organized returned books on the library shelves. You're such a wonderful cook, Beverly. Have you ever thought about running a little cafe or restaurant? The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. I'd never operated a business before, never even managed anything more complicated than my own personal household budget. But I had substantial savings from 30 years of careful, frugal living, and the cabin was completely paid for, so my overhead costs would be relatively minimal. I rented a small building on Main Street that had housed a bakery many years earlier and spent the entire fall season renovating it into Beverly's Kitchen. Nothing elaborate or pretentious, just 8 comfortable tables, a counter with 6 stools, and a fully equipped kitchen where I could prepare the kind of comfort food I'd been perfecting for decades. The restaurant opened in December of 2015, exactly 10 months after Richard's death. On opening day, it seemed like half the town showed up to wish me well and sample my chicken and dumplings, my chocolate layer cake, and my famous cinnamon rolls that had been the one culinary creation Richard consistently praised during our marriage. Standing behind the counter of my own little restaurant, watching neighbors and new friends enjoy food I'd prepared with my own hands, I experienced something I hadn't felt in 30 years, genuine pride in myself. Not pride in being someone's wife or maintaining someone else's home, but pride in something I'd built from nothing through my own effort and determination. That night, I sat in the cabin reading one of Richard's letters, and for the first time since discovering them, I didn't cry. Instead, I felt profoundly grateful. Grateful for the love that had sustained both of us through 3 decades of painful separation. Grateful for the suffering that had taught me to recognize and appreciate happiness when it finally arrived. Grateful even for the mistakes and regrets that had shown me what truly matters in this brief life we're given. I realized that Richard's final gift wasn't just the cabin or the letters or the truth about his feelings. It was the opportunity to start completely over, to build an existence based on who I really was, rather than who I thought I needed to be for someone else's approval. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the deepest wounds, and the key to healing isn't changing the past, but understanding it with a heart that's finally ready to forgive. As I share this story with you today, nearly 10 years have passed since I discovered the truth about Richard's love for me. I still live in the cabin he left me, still operate Beverly's Kitchen, still volunteer at the monthly health clinic. Martha passed away 3 years ago, but not before she became the mother figure I'd never really had, teaching me that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. I never remarried, never found another great romantic love. But I discovered something perhaps more valuable, complete peace with my own story. The 30 years I thought I'd wasted in a loveless marriage turned out to be 30 years of loving and being loved, just not in the way I'd understood at the time. Richard and I never got our fairy tale happy ending, but we received something better. We got the truth about each other's hearts, and sometimes the truth is enough to heal even the deepest wounds and set us free to write an entirely new chapter. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this journey. Have you ever discovered something about a loved one that completely changed how you understood your relationship with them? Have you learned that forgiveness can be liberating, even when it comes too late to repair the damage? Please share your experiences in the comments below. If this story touched your heart in any way, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about love loss and the surprising ways healing can find us when we least expect it. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late for understanding forgiveness and fresh beginnings. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that even our greatest disappointments can become our most precious gifts when we learn to see them with new eyes and an open heart.